Hello, everyone. Just a couple of reminders before we get started. My expectation isn't that you're writing down every single word that I say or every single word on the slide. You're welcome to paraphrase. It's up to you to choose what you think is the most pertinent information and get that down. Remember that you are not in a rush because you can rewind this video, pause this video if I'm speaking too fast and you need to catch up. So that is a major benefit of the flipped classroom, so please feel free to take advantage of it. Okay, so let's get started. So we're talking about government foundations today, in part one, and here are our objectives for today. Today you're going to understand the ideas of limited government, including natural rights, popular sovereignty, republicanism, and social contract. You're going to recognize different forms of representative democracies. And finally, you're going to be able to recognize and explain different forms of government. So we're going to start with what is government? Well, the institutions and processes through which public policies are made for society. So our government makes laws, executes those laws, and also interprets those laws. So in America, our government is made up of a few parts. We have Congress, who makes the laws. It's made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the presidency, the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, and then the lower courts, and finally, the bureaucracy or federal agencies who help the president to execute the laws. So in political science, we'll often see these two key questions, and you can jot down these two questions in your notes, and I know it was in your summer reading as well. But two questions that political scientists grapple with. The first one is who governs, right? And we'll come back to these two questions all year, but who governs? Some questions that we might ask ourselves around this idea of who governs are members of Congress representative of the American people, right? Here's Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader. Another question we might ask around who governs is if only Congress can declare war, why has the president become so powerful in military affairs? The next part of this idea of who governs is to what ends, right? How do they do it? So a question we might ask around this question of to what ends is why do we go to war against some dictatorships and not others? So this is a photograph of the United States toppling the dictator Saddam Hussein and his regime during the Iraq War. Another question we might ask is, should Congress act more quickly, right? A lot of people are frustrated right now with Congress because they appear to be in a gridlock and it's preventing them from getting anything done. So our two key questions. As we go through this PowerPoint, we're going to look at power distribution and types of government. You don't need to write down these questions, but these are some things that we're thinking about. So number one, what type of government establishes who has the power? And how is power divided within that type of government? Okay. So we're going to talk first about types of government, and we're going to start with types of democracy. So democracy, as I'm sure you're aware, is the rule of the people. The first democracy was established in Athens, Greece in around 5th century BC, and that democracy was a direct democracy. This is where all citizens participate. So they show up, they raise their hands, and they vote. We don't really see this anymore except in very small settings, like possibly a town hall setting. If you could pause me right now and just jot down some advantages and disadvantages of a direct democracy in your notes, that would be great. The second type of democracy is a representative democracy, where representatives are chosen to represent the will of the people. And this is called a republic. So in the United States, we have a representative democracy, right? I don't go and vote for every single law. I wouldn't have the time to do that. So I choose a representative. For example, my congressman is Steve Chabot. So I might vote for Steve Chabot so that he can go and represent me and my interests in Washington. And I hope that my representative will vote the way that I want him to. Another type of democracy is a presidential democracy. So we have a representative democracy in the United States that is also a presidential democracy. So in a presidential democracy, such as the United States, citizens vote for their legislators and also for the president. So here we see the legislative and executive powers are separated, right? So we see here voters, they vote for the president, and they vote for the legislature, for members of Congress. In a parliamentary democracy, voters elect only their legislators. Then the majority party in parliament chooses one of its own to be the prime minister. And so here we see the legislative and the executive powers are joined. Some examples of this are Great Britain, India, and South Africa all have parliamentary democracies. And here's a visual for you. Voters vote for members of parliament who then choose the prime minister. Before we move on, I want to look briefly at a key influence on American democracy, and that is John Locke. And we'll talk about some other Enlightenment philosophers during this unit as well. This will probably be a refresher for you from world history, but you'll remember from world history that the Enlightenment is this time period in European history where there are lots of new ideas about government and human nature and religion, right? And so we have John Locke here. He's a British philosopher, and in 1689, he writes a very important document, Two Treatises of Government, and he writes under a pseudonym because what he was writing about at this time was extremely controversial, right? So he didn't want to put his name on it immediately. But anyways, he writes this document, and it serves as a foundation for many of America's founding documents, like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And in this document, he gives us two core beliefs that we see reflected in our democracy today. And I want you to write these down. The first one is this idea of natural rights. Natural rights are essentially human rights, rights that cannot be taken away from you. And according to John Locke, our natural rights are life, liberty, and property. These are rights that everyone is just born having. You have the right to life, you have the right to liberty, and you have the right to own some property. The second key idea that we get from John Locke is this idea of a social contract. This is where people agree to give up some of their freedom and give the government power. And in return for that, the government is supposed to protect our natural rights. But if the government abuses the power and violates the natural rights of the people have the right to replace or overthrow the government and establish a new government. So this idea of social contract, very important, and we see this reflected again in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. Both of these ideas of natural rights and social contract lead us to this key foundation of our democracy, which is popular sovereignty, which is basically the principle that the authority of the government is created and sustained by the consent of the people because the people allow the government to exist. This idea of popular sovereignty is seen all over our founding documents, and it's reflected most clearly in the first words of the Constitution, we the people. That is popular sovereignty right there. So we're going to segue from types of democracy and look briefly at some other types of government. We're first going to look at monarchies. So monarchies are a system of government where a single ruler exercises supreme power based on heredity, you were born into it, or divine right. Divine right is the belief that kings and queens get their power from God. So at the time that John Locke was writing, all of the governments in Europe were some type of monarchy. A lot of them were still absolute monarchies. This is hereditary, you're born into it, and these kings and queens had unlimited power. Today, we see an absolute monarchy in Saudi Arabia. Here's King Salman of Saudi Arabia, the absolute monarch. Another type of monarchy is a constitutional monarchy. This is where the king or the queen shares some power with parliament and it's semi-democratic. We see constitutional monarchies all over Europe today. Spain, Sweden, Denmark, they all have constitutional monarchies. And this idea of a constitutional monarchy was first put forth in the Magna Carta, written in 1215. The Magna Carta was signed by England's King John, who, under the threat of a rebellion, signed the Magna Carta. That's basically a charter of liberties, and it says that the king is beholden to the law, right? That kings and queens will serve within the rule of law. So this is a foundational document for our founding documents as well. Another form of government where basically just one person is in charge is an autocracy. So this is a single ruler who rules with selfish interests. You might also hear them referred to as a tyrant, a despot, a dictator, a king, or an emperor. An autocracy, one person at the top. An example of an autocracy from history, this is Benito Mussolini of Italy, or the Italian dictator during World War II. Moving on, also you will see during this course, we'll talk about oligarchies. So this is a form of government in which the power to rule is held by a small and usually self-appointed elite. And there are lots and lots of different ways a minority can rule over a majority. I just want you to have a few of these down in your notes. I'm going to highlight which ones for you right now. So the first is a theocracy. In the second part of the year, we'll talk about Iran, which is a theocracy ruled by religious leaders. And here's the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei. He's the supreme leader of the Ayatollah. Another type of oligarchy is a single-party state ruled by the political elite. An example of that would be the Nazi Party in Nazi Germany. Just one party existed. And a third example that you can jot down in your notes is communism. Communism is a type of oligarchy, a rule by a single party based on a command economy. And an example of this would be Mao Zedong's China. So I'm going to stop there. We will continue with our government foundations in our next video. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all soon.